The Q&A from the May 2026 financials have now been officially translated by Nintendo. While there have been news headlines in advance, I generally like to see Nintendo's own translations where possible, and my conclusion is that this is one of the dullest Q&As, and while desperate headlines have come up with Nintendo promises new games over the last couple of days, these feel to me like completely boilerplate rehearsed answers straight from the playbook. Still, there are a few things to discuss in here, and so let's read and review. As ever, the terrific twosome at the top are Shuntaro Furukawa as the president and Hajime Murakami, who normally shadows him in these kinds of events. Question 1. For the current fiscal year, ending March 2027, you are forecasting Nintendo Switch 2 hardware sales of 16.5 million units. Could you give us some background about how you reached that number? Also, how do you see the adoption of Nintendo Switch 2 trending over the medium to long term? Shuntaro Furukawa responds, when Nintendo Switch 2 was launched in June of last year, we worked to expand production capacity so the system was available to as many people as possible. In addition, we held Nintendo Switch 2 experience events before the launch around the world, which generated consumer interest, and this also helped drive sales far beyond our expectations in that first fiscal year. The result was that sales through to the end of the last fiscal year, ending March 2026, reached 19.86 million units, exceeding both our initial forecast of 50 million units and our revised forecast of 19 million units, which we announced at our 6 months earning report. That number of 19.86 million units in the first fiscal year was exceptionally high compared to our past hardware launches. This performance was supported by a variety of overlapping factors, including the fact that Nintendo Switch 2 launched while many people are still having fun playing Nintendo Switch, and the ability of Nintendo Switch 2 to play Nintendo Switch software helped make transition easier. At the time of our 9-month earning release, we explained that while we had a strong holiday season in Japan, the results were weaker than expected in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe and the US. However, the release of Animal Crossing New Horizons Nintendo Switch 2 Edition and the free update for Animal Crossing New Horizons in January boosted engagement for both Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2. Furthermore, in March, Pokémon Pocopia was released for Nintendo Switch 2, which performed well in Japan and other regions, driving hardware sales. In light of these factors, we believe that Nintendo Switch 2 is entering its second year in good shape. For the current fiscal year, we've set out the initial sales forecast as 16.5 million units. This takes into account the current sales momentum, as well as the sales performance seen in the second year of our past dedicated video game systems. As mentioned in our financial results explanatory material, the pace of adoption of Nintendo Switch 2 is extremely fast, even when compared to Nintendo Switch, and we do not see any particular concerns about its momentum at this time. The way that Pokémon Pocopia has contributed to hardware sales reaffirms our belief that the availability of software that people want to play is a key factor supporting the transition to Nintendo Switch 2. Going forward, we have many new titles for Nintendo Switch 2 prepared, and we will carefully convey the appeal of each title to encourage people to transition to Nintendo Switch 2 at their own pace. In that context, we will work to increase the Nintendo Switch 2 install base over the medium to long term and increase software sales and the number of annual playing users. End quote. So just a few points to make here. First of all, this is the first time that I can think of that we've seen a specific reference to the success of the re-release of Animal Crossing New Horizons, although it is framed in terms of engagement rather than flat-out sales. Now, although the Nintendo Switch 2 edition didn't rack up 1 million sales in its own right, which would have led to it being reported on, you have to think that even if a small percentage of that massive install base came over, it would have a significant impact on Nintendo's margins for that particular game. I also think that there had to be some kind of thought process behind the strategy for the first half of this year, where you had Pocopia and Tomodachi Life pretty much back to back after Animal Crossing. So raising the salience of Animal Crossing New Horizons at a time when they were due to release two quite big deal cozy games, one a Switch 2 game, the other a Switch game, was, to my mind, probably not coincidental. Now, Nintendo doesn't have many games of that kind of caliber and appeal that would drive players towards the new console, but the obvious one that remains on the table is Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, another major big deal Switch game that has yet to have any kind of direct sequel on the Switch 2, although there it's far less straightforward for Nintendo to unilaterally decide a direction, as they will want to harness the enthusiasm of Masahiro Sakurai, and doing a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of his previous game might not be the best way to achieve that. Furukawa also discusses how they exceeded expectations, and this was quite largely due to having a large amount of stock on hand. I think he and the company should get quite a lot of credit for managing this, actually, as the stock shortages have historically been a feature of Nintendo console launches, any that have had even mild success out of the gate at any rate. He talks about the availability of software being a key driver, which is obviously the case, but I think this also may play into not just the titles they're pushing forward, but the titles they could be holding back, at least in a short window of time. This response shows that they were modulating their expectations of sales in reaction to high and then falling demand for the console over 2025. And I wonder, and this is just me spitballing, but I wonder if it may be that they had an existing plan of game releases that they were also flexing and contracting in response to events. So think about it, if you're Nintendo in mid-2025 and the system is selling like gangbusters, releasing news of a major AAA game might be something that would give you pause, because after all, you don't need to drive demand anymore at that point. They then announced Pocopia for a generic 2026 date in the September Direct, and they still hadn't had a confirmed date for Tomodachi Life at that point. But by the middle of November, when they realized that the sales trajectory in the West was not quite as strong as they might have hoped, and it looked like they probably reached the end of their big demand surge, well, in November they announced Pocopia for March. Now, I'm not saying that this game was sat on a shelf indefinitely and Nintendo were just waiting to pull the trigger, but I think there's a version of 2026 where Switch 2 demand is still going at top speed, where they're far more cautious about bundling these games out of the door in such quick succession. However, I do think they represent, by accidental design, a second wave of targeting a new Switch 2 audience. The action-focused gamers had Mario Kart, Bonanza, Air Riders, and Metroid Prime, and now Nintendo are pivoting to focus on their considerable cozy audience, many of whom, of course, came over to Nintendo consoles during the pandemic. You could even argue that summer 2025 is representing a third wave, specifically trying to bring on board the new system fans of specific, relatively niche properties with dedicated fan bases, such as Fire Emblem, Splatoon, and Star Fox. Now, perhaps this is all just a coincidence, but I will be interested to see if there are other examples of this around the release of subsequent hardware revisions, where we see different waves of types of games being released. Question 2. The earnings forecast for the current fiscal year factors in approximately 100 billion yen due to the rising prices of components, particularly for memory chips, and the impact of tariffs on costs. Am I correct in understanding that the impact of tariffs is an absolute amount rather than a difference compared to the previous fiscal year? Also, how did you calculate the increase in memory prices that got factored in? Furukawa responds, regarding tariffs, your understanding is correct. We are applying an absolute amount, not a difference compared to the previous fiscal year. As we have explained before, the rise in memory and other component prices did not have a major impact on the profitability of the hardware last fiscal year. However, we forecast that prices will continue to rise, and we believe this will gradually put pressure on the profitability of the hardware from this fiscal year onward. We do not discuss any details concerning how we calculate the amount of impact, but based on our current sales plan and procurement situation, we calculated the impact of the rise in memory and other component prices, and added to that the impact of tariffs on costs of goods sold to come up with the figure of approximately 100 billion yen. End quote. So approximately 100 billion yen is the ultimate approximate figure, but I can't really blame Furukawa for being relatively vague because the situation is so febrile and there are so many unknowns. My guess is that they rounded up rather than down, since they usually prefer to be cautious in their estimates, but who knows. He seems to indicate that the hardware remains profitable, but that without the adjustments, pressure would be exerted, which I guess depends on their negotiated contracts with memory suppliers, which is also probably the reason why they didn't rush to make changes when a few months ago memory became a concern. Question 3. Could you explain the reasoning behind the decision to revise the price of the Nintendo Switch 2 hardware in the second year after its launch? Also, why is the extent of the change in price different in Japan, the US, and Europe? Furukawa responds, This change in hardware pricing was not due to any one specific factor. Rather, the decision was made in light of various changes in the recent market conditions, which we believe will have a medium to long term impact on the global outlook of our dedicated video game platform business. Regarding Nintendo Switch 2, the basic approach to our dedicated video game platform business remains unchanged. First, expand the hardware install base and then drive software sales. If the increasing costs were seen as something temporary that would subside relatively soon, then we could have purchased other options, such as working to improve productivity and expand the install base while maintaining hardware prices. Unfortunately, the recent surge in memory and other component prices and the changes in the market environment, including trends in the foreign exchange market and the price of oil, are all factors that we anticipate will continue over the medium to long term. As a result, we felt that the profitability of our hardware would suffer significantly if we maintained our existing pricing, potentially impacting our business operations over this time frame. For the sustained growth of our dedicated video game platform business, it is important to maintain a healthy earnings structure for our overall business. For this reason, we made the difficult decision to reflect a portion of our costs in the selling price. The reason that the extent of the price revisions differ from region to region is because each region is impacted to a different degree by the various changes in the market environment. End quote. Okay, let's break this one down. Firstly, he talks about medium to long-term market conditions and he breaks down 5 specific drivers of their considerations: memory and component prices, tariff impacts, foreign exchange fluctuations, and changes in the price of oil. He also notes that each region is affected differently and hence the prices are different. So obviously the American region is particularly, due to a significant portion of that being the USA, affected by tariffs, whereas other issues are more significant in different parts of the world. Now, pricing something for the long term is inherently difficult, but particularly in a febrile market. Medium to long term in the life of this console is, they will hope, about a period of 8 to 10 years, and so you would have to think only about the changes in the last 8 to 10 years and project that kind of change forward to see why things will be so uncertain. Having said that, Nintendo would have made the same calls last year, and these changes are new. Now, the exchange rate market conditions went under the radar a little bit, and I saw in the comments someone observing that since the price was announced in the Japanese market, the yen weakened considerably against the dollar. Now, all that said, the yen is similar in relative strength now to the end of 2024 when manufacturing began, and they have seen dips and spikes over recent years. So it's not completely new for Nintendo to have to deal with the yen becoming weaker again. Also, the weak yen has had pros and cons for them. In general, it means that it's costly to manufacture if they're spending in yen, but of course, they also stand to make more money from selling abroad as well, and they sell more product abroad than they do in the Japanese market. Now, as it turned out, the yen weakened significantly in the few months of manufacture, but before release, meaning that Nintendo could be said to have timed it fairly perfectly. I did a video about this a few months ago, which I won't now release on YouTube as it's a bit dated, but can be seen on Patreon. Basically, though, their timing was chef's kiss perfection from a foreign exchange point of view for consoles coming into the Japanese market, as their manufacturing contracts were presumably arranged at the exchange rate at the relative high point of November and December 2024. However, of course, with the yen then weakening, they were able to profit more from what they were selling abroad. However, it's true that the exchange rates would add an extra headache for the Japanese market, and the strong early take-up in their domestic territory means that they probably can afford to be a bit more aggressive in their pricing than they have been so far anyway. All that said, as I covered last year, once you factor in cost of living realities in the various territories, the Japanese price isn't anywhere near as good as it looks on paper for people on the ground, so I wonder if another factor they're considering is the presence of a strong lineup of games that will drive sales specifically in the Japanese market, since, as Furukawa already noted, software is critical to the take-up of the machine. Now, we've already seen what a market like this could be with Splatoon, Fire Emblem, and Tomodachi Life all being games which have a big popularity in Japan. Now, the expectation here is that Nintendo wanted to get a price that it would stick to, but I also think they always knew that they would need some fudging room. And actually, I said way back in 2024 that I thought $500 with some kind of extra sweetener, such as a Nintendo Switch Online year that they could then pull back on, would be the way they might want to go, given the general uncertainties around cost. I think this section also bears specific rereading. For the sustained growth of our dedicated video game platform business, it is important to maintain a healthy earnings structure for our overall business. For this reason, we made the difficult decision to reflect a portion of our costs in the selling price. In other words, they don't consider their current arrangements sufficient, but want to grow their output capacity, the capacity of their dedicated video game platform business. And of course, this does rely on having strong income in order to support those new people and new initiatives. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a massive increase in their output rate, as the jump to 4K in itself will require huge expansion, and they're committed to things like the building of their new location. But decisions taken now could be very interesting to reflect on around 2030 if we start to see a very solid lineup of games then, because they decided not to consolidate now when they could have decided just to pull back and try to focus on what they're doing, but instead they decided to press forward and, presumably it seems, to continue to expand. Question 4. The price changes for Nintendo Switch 2 hardware are occurring in the midst of a major increase in the cost of living. What impact do you anticipate the adjustment will have on sales momentum? Also, if component costs continue to increase, is there a chance that you will change the prices again? Furukawa responds, I will not discuss the specifics of how this price revision could impact Nintendo Switch 2 sales, but we recognize that this raises the barrier for entry to a certain extent for people deciding whether to make a purchase. That being said, the most important thing in our dedicated video game platform business is to offer engaging fun that is worth more than the price. Going forward, Nintendo and other software publishers plan to release a variety of titles, and we aim to expand the installed base by conveying that these titles offer new experiences unique to Nintendo Switch 2. While uncertainties remain regarding future trends in component prices, we recognize that they could have an impact not only this year but next year as well. As for what comes after that, we will make necessary preparations to ensure that we can respond flexibly to whatever situations arise. End quote. Basically, a non-answer answer as far as I can see. Releasing new software to win people over is a fairly straightforward solution, although I am a little intrigued by what he might be hinting at when he says new experiences unique to Switch 2. This probably simply reflects the graphical capabilities and, of course, their unique lineup of games, but knowing Nintendo, they will continue to be trying to sweat the unique properties of the system in other ways, and the Star Fox AR filters on Game Chat feel like just one example of this. The concept of value of being more than the price is actually something that I did a long podcast on for Patreon the other day, and I'm sure that will reach YouTube at some point this year. Question 5. In your dedicated video game platform business up to now, there was a trend of concentrating releases of major first-party titles when new hardware was launched in order to encourage adoption and expand the installed base. Are you considering using these kinds of major titles to accelerate hardware adoption for Nintendo Switch 2 in the same way? Or, considering that many consumers continue to play Nintendo Switch, will you be releasing titles on a different timeline than before? Furukawa responds, in the medium to long term, I believe it is important for us to continuously introduce appealing new titles to encourage consumers to choose Nintendo hardware. Looking at the history of our dedicated video game platform business, the release of major titles that were expected to drive hardware sales did, in fact, greatly increase hardware unit sales. We believe that this trend will continue. Nintendo Switch 2 hardware sell-through increased due to the recent release of Pokémon Pokopia in March, giving us a strong start to the current fiscal year. In addition, the Nintendo Switch title Tomodachi Life Living the Dream, released at the beginning of this fiscal year, is being played by many users around the world, and approximately 40% of players are Nintendo Switch 2 owners. We believe that the release of these new titles has invigorated engagement on both hardware platforms. While changes in the market environment have been factored into the financial projections for this fiscal year, our current sales are favourable as we enter the new fiscal year. Going forward, we will continue to work towards maintaining sales momentum by releasing a variety of titles. End quote. So basically the question is, when is Sweetie Mario coming? And the answer is, well, you already had Tomodachi Life. I think the answer behind the answer, though, is that yes, of course, Nintendo would like to release AAA titles, but they also want to expand the total field of titles that have AAA potential, something they managed in a big way during the Switch era with previously more niche endeavours like Luigi's Mansion, even Mario Party especially, although a great many of their properties also benefited from the so-called Switch effect. Putting these series front and centre early on does create an element of hunger for new titles, but they also don't just want the same old titles to be driving appeal as what happens if these don't work out. Would Bonanza have had the same attention if it followed soon after 3D Mario? Would Tomodachi have been as big if it came after a brand new Animal Crossing? You can't split test reality, and of course the 3DS Tomodachi Life followed New Leaf and did very well, so perhaps this plan would have worked out just fine. But if their approach is continuously releasing appealing hardware and software, then especially in the context of a long generation, growing the number of titles that have broad appeal while being a little restrained with their top properties might not be the worst thing in encouraging people to try different kinds of Nintendo properties. And of course, this could all be making a virtue of a necessity, and if the games aren't ready, then it's just what Nintendo would have had to do. But ultimately, less scrupulous studios would just shove games out the door, and Nintendo generally, but not always, will stick to their guns until a title is either good or at least as good as they feel they're reasonably going to achieve from their starting points. So I think there is some reason to think that Nintendo are acting in the way they're doing in order to protect the integrity of their new AAA games and to give them the maximum time they need for release, but also in order to subtly raise the profile of a few other properties which might otherwise have gone under the radar. Question 6. With the 30th anniversary of the release of Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green in Japan, Pokemon-related titles have shown strong sales. But could you tell us more about the state of this IP and future initiatives from a global perspective? Hardware bundled with Pokemon Legends ZA Nintendo Switch 2 edition sold well during the last holiday season, and Pokemon Pocopia, released in March, has seen favourable sales. This situation also seems to extend to the release of the new Pokemon Winds and Pokemon Waves titles in 2027. Furukawa responds, for Pokemon-related titles, Pokemon Fire Red and Pokemon Leaf Green, released as download-only titles in February, together had a global cumulative sell-through of more than 4 million units in the first 6 weeks. And Pokemon Pocopia, released in March, had global cumulative sell-through exceeding 4 million in the first 5 weeks. This year is the 30th anniversary of the release of Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green, and the Pokemon IP has become increasingly popular around the world and is in a very strong position, not only for the video games, but also for the card games, mobile apps, and other areas of the business. We are grateful that Pokemon Pocopia, which was released as a Nintendo Switch 2 title as part of the 30th anniversary, is driving hardware sales, and we hope to see it become a new evergreen title for Nintendo Switch 2 with a long sales life. In addition, Pokemon Winds and Pokemon Waves will be released in 2027, and going forward, we will continue to work with the Pokemon Company to encourage consumers playing Pokemon titles to transition to Nintendo Switch 2. Now, this is a complete non-answer as far as I can tell, but to be fair, it was largely a non-question since Furukawa isn't really in a position to speak directly to larger strategic concerns with Pokemon without consultation with the Pokemon Company. Basically, though, I do think he can be pretty pleased with the performance of Pokemon in the early part of the Switch 2's life, given the success of Pokemon Legends ZA and of Pocopia, let alone with the re-releases of the Game Boy Advance games. Part of that is obviously the fact that Pokemon is releasing a significant number of games linked to their anniversary, but then again, it's the Mario anniversary as well, and as I reflected on with my previous video deep diving their financials, I'm not entirely sure that the 40th anniversary of Mario was quite as successful as the Pokemon one seems to have been. Question 7. What is your approach to software development over the medium to long term? Due to the increase in development time, I imagine it would be difficult to release major titles for Nintendo Switch 2 at the same pace you have released software in the past. Furukawa responds, while it would be ideal to release many new titles at regular intervals, it's true that software development time has increased compared to before. Even so, we are taking various measures to adjust our development framework and processes so that there will be numerous titles for consumers to play on Nintendo Switch 2. We are working on a variety of new titles for Nintendo Switch 2 and not just so-called major titles. For the lineup of the second half of the year, we are preparing new titles in addition to those we have already announced and will communicate the details at the appropriate time. End quote. Now, I've separately deep dived some of the things Nintendo can do and are doing to expedite development times, but I do think that the new Star Fox is a good example of a successful strategy that they are and may continue to deploy. Developing for new hardware long in advance is tricky, as the full specs of the system might not be nailed down yet, and although it seems with Switch 2 they pretty much knew where they were going a long time in advance, creating a game against the backdrop of a changing development landscape has to add extra complexity, especially when there's a lot of pressure on such a game to be a major AAA that's going to carry a generation for potentially a decade or more. It's notable that Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza were both originally conceived of for the Switch. However, if you take away the complexity of actually making the core gameplay mechanics and just focus on acclimatizing the developers to the features of a new console, it strikes me as potentially easier to create a great looking game in a relatively short space of time. It helps that Nintendo currently has a large number of relatively new recruits from 2020 onwards who may not yet be fully oriented, to the company's tastes at least, to the Nintendo development philosophy. This makes revisiting Star Fox 64 and likely Ocarina of Time useful in multiple ways for the company. Of course, Furukawa also talks about adjusting development processes more generally, and I find this intriguing. This could be things like having more smaller games that otherwise could have just been prototypes on the shelves. Dragon Drive and Welcome Tour both feel like they could fit into this category. It could mean reusing assets from past games more effectively as well. If they are indeed working on an original Star Fox title, once that prototype is in good shape, they should already have a huge number of existing assets in terms of graphics, sound, and even UI features that will rapidly expedite the process from there. Nintendo hasn't always behaved like this, but it is a feature we've seen a lot in the last roughly a decade of having previous content that they can recycle going forward. Breath of the Wild was a huge cost sink, but they also got Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity out of it, adapted elements to help Ring Fit Adventure, and then they were able to recycle the world and many graphical assets for Tears of the Kingdom, which then of course spawned Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment. Major projects may feel far less risky if they're seen as hub projects where they can ameliorate costs over many different uses in the coming years. Of course, this is risky too. If they had hopes to do this with Metroid Prime 4, those hopes have probably been dashed by that game's relatively muted reception, although of course, if you look at Ring Fit Adventure and you look at Zelda Breath of the Wild, there is no immediate comparison between them, so it's not necessarily the case that a reuse of elements from Metroid Prime 4 would have to include a Metroid game. But at any rate, if they have enough of these hub projects ready to go, then Nintendo can probably hope that several of them will indeed work out, which will then carry any that don't. Question 8 then, and since it's a double question, I'm actually going to split it down and review the two answers separately, as I think these are quite separate questions, in fact. Question 8. Sales of Mario Kart World seem to have slowed down since the shipments of the hardware bundle concluded in December. What is your assessment of the reasons behind this? Furukawa says, while I will refrain from talking about the state of sales for individual titles, Mario Kart World is an important title that we would like to continue selling throughout the life of the Nintendo Switch 2. Going forward, we will continue to convey its appeal to consumers to expand its popularity as an evergreen title. So, a complete non-answer really. Now, I do think that the pace of the sales isn't actually too bad for World when you consider that anybody who wanted the game would have been incentivized to get the bundle earlier, and the January to March buyers probably included a large number of Pocopia players. Basically, the only people who would have wanted Mario Kart World during that quarter were people who weren't particularly aware that there was a good deal earlier, or at least couldn't afford to leap on board just then. Can it reach Mario Kart 8 Deluxe numbers in the long term? Well, that's a big ask, but it's not impossible over the ultra long term that they do continue to develop it, and it does quite well. The thing about it being an evergreen is that any individual quarter sales are far less important than the long-term trend, and I think part of the reason that it seems to have dipped a bit is probably just a warping effect from having it be bundled with the system early on for a limited period. The second part of question 8 says, in addition, what is the background behind the 60 million units of Nintendo Switch 2 software projected for this fiscal year? Furukawa responds, I believe it is important that we consider how to expand the entire software business, including titles for both Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2, instead of focusing only on sales of Nintendo Switch 2 software. The result for unit software sales last fiscal year included software bundled with hardware and other products, while the sales unit forecasts for this fiscal year does not include bundled software. Based on that premise, the software sales unit forecast for this fiscal year was set at a level close to the total combined number of Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2 software units sold last year, excluding the bundled software units. End quotes. This has the added complexity that they are now bundling a choice of games in some territories, but I think overall it's probably helpful for Nintendo just to count the software separate from the hardware, even though it did make sense to include them jointly at the beginning of the Switch 2's life when so many people were opting for the Mario Kart bundle. I think the focus on not just Switch 2 but Switch games is interesting, and I certainly think Nintendo will want to keep their eye on promoting that very deep bench of games at least until the end of next year, when they may have new hardware that they hope will allow them to transition a bigger portion of their player base to the new machine. But even then, in the longer term, it must be incredibly helpful for them to have that deep library, and they're going to want to find continued ways to bring it back to people's attention. The fact is, though, there's a lot they can still do to promote and sweat their vast library, especially in the knowledge that it may be harder to do this in certain cases once the games have effectively been superseded by a new version. So, for example, if there is going to be a Metroid 6 in the next year or so, then they may think that they would like to do more with Metroid Dread right before. At any rate, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.